She was 38 years old when they told her she had nothing. They said her life on this land was a story that had ended. But what they did not know, what no one in the valley knew, was that she carried a memory of stone and heat that would not let her die. Stay close, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. The road that led to the Mercer homestead in the autumn of 1888 was little more than a suggestion etched into the rolling brown flank of the foothills, a line of concession the land made to the passage of wagons. From that road, a stranger would have seen a small, square-built cabin of lodgepole pine, a leaning barn, and a tidy woodshed, all of it looking braced for a winter that was already making its presence known in the sharp, clean edge of the wind. The year had been dry, and the grasses had cured to a pale and brittle gold that rustled with a sound like paper. It was the third week of October, and the mountains to the west wore a fresh and unnerving coat of early snow. A woman could be seen moving with a steady, unhurried rhythm between the house and the woodshed, her arms loaded with split pine. She did not look up at the sound of the approaching wagon, not because she hadn't heard it, but because the work of stacking wood permitted no interruption. Her name was Elspeth Mercer, and she had buried her husband Thomas 10 days prior. The wagon belonged to her brother-in-law. Silas Mercer was a man whose presence filled a room before he entered it, a man for whom the world was a series of assets to be managed. His wife Clara sat beside him, a small bird-like woman wrapped in a wool shawl that could not conceal the rigid set of her spine. They did not stop to help with the wood. They tied their horse and went directly to the cabin door, which Elspeth had left open to the thin afternoon sun. She followed them in, laying her burden of firewood in the box beside the cold cast-iron stove, and wiped the pitch from her hands with a rough cloth. The cabin was one room, impeccably clean, smelling of pine and the lingering scent of the dried herbs that hung from the rafters. It was the home she and Thomas had built with their own hands 6 years before. "Elspeth," Silas began, his voice lacking its usual booming confidence. He placed a leather portfolio on the pine table that Thomas had built. "Clara and I have come out of concern and necessity." Clara said nothing, her eyes taking in the details of the room as if assessing them for an auction. Elspeth waited. She had learned waiting from the seasons, from the slow germination of seeds, from the deliberate way a glacier had carved this very valley. She poured 3 cups of water from the bucket by the door. She did not offer coffee, which she could no longer afford. Silas opened the portfolio. He spread a sheaf of papers on the table, their official headings stark against the worn wood. "Thomas was a good man," he said, a preamble to a coming cruelty. "But he was not a practical one. He took a loan from me 2 years ago, for seed and a new bull. The homestead was his collateral." He slid a deed of title across the table. His signature was on it as the lineholder. It was all legal, all properly stamped and sealed by a clerk in Helena. "The note is past due. With his passing, the debt falls to the estate, and the estate is the land." Elspeth looked at the papers. She did not need to read them. She had known of the loan, but Thomas had always spoken of it as an arrangement, a family matter that would be settled with a good harvest. She looked at Silas's face, scrubbed clean of any sentiment, and saw that the harvest had come. But it was not the one she and Thomas had planted. "I am the estate," Elspeth said. It was not a question. "The estate is insolvent," Silas corrected, his voice gaining its familiar authority. "The land reverts to me. Clara and I have discussed it. We will not be uncharitable. You may stay until the first hard frost. After that, you will need to make other arrangements. The church in Two Forks can help you find a position, perhaps as a housekeeper." The first hard frost was not a date on a calendar. It was a judgment, already gathering in the high country. It could be a month away, or a week. Elspeth looked from Silas's impassive face to Clara's, which held a flicker of what might have been pity or might have been satisfaction. She pushed the papers back across the table. "This is my home," she said, her voice quiet but as solid as the river stones that made the foundation. "I am not leaving." Silas sighed, a sound of practiced patience. "Elspeth, be reasonable. You cannot survive a winter here alone. You have no money, no credit. We will be taking possession of the livestock as partial payment. It is the kindest option." He gathered his papers, his movements crisp and final. "The offer stands. Until the frost. Then the kindness ends." They turned and left, the screen door slapping shut behind them. Elspeth stood at the table, listening to the sound of their wagon retreating down the road, until the only sound was the rustle of the dry grass, whispering of the cold to come. She had not moved. She would not be moved. The community of Two Forks, what little of it existed, registered the Mercers' visit with the quiet, pervasive hum of shared knowledge that passes for news in isolated places. The consensus formed quickly, solidified over conversations at the feed store and after the Sunday sermon. It was a tragedy, they agreed. Poor Elspeth, widowed and now to be landless. Silas Mercer was a hard man, but the law was the law. A debt was a debt. The women of the church auxiliary spoke of collecting clothes and finding her a room in town, a charity Elspeth had not asked for and would not accept. Their pity was a soft, suffocating blanket she refused to be smothered by. The men, for their part, simply shook their heads and said she had no chance. The almanac, which held more sway than the Bible in matters of life and death, was predicting a winter of unusual severity. The beavers were building their dams high, the squirrels' coats were thick, and the old-timers felt a familiar ache in their bones that spoke of deep snow and killing cold. Silas Mercer did not need to be cruel in public. His cruelty was methodical and private. A week after his visit, Elspeth drove her small cart into Two Forks for supplies and found her credit at the general store had been revoked. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, could not meet her eye. "Silas was in yesterday, Elspeth," he explained, his voice low as he polished a stack of canned peaches. "He settled your account and instructed me that any further purchases were to be paid in cash." He knew she had no cash. Everyone knew. It was not an act of malice on Henderson's part. It was business. Silas was his biggest customer. The town ran on such invisible currents of power, and Elspeth now found herself fighting an upstream battle against the whole flow of the valley's commerce. She left with only a small bag of salt she could afford with the coins she had, and the weight of the town's collective gaze on her back. They were watching her, waiting for her to break, to pack her few belongings and accept her fate. They expected her to be gone by the first snows of November, but Elspeth had begun a different kind of calculation, one that had nothing to do with money or the opinions of her neighbors. She had taken a full inventory of her assets, not the ones Silas could seize, but the ones he could not see. She had one milk cow, Bess, whose life she would defend as her own. She had a small flock of chickens. She had the remaining vegetables from her garden, potatoes, carrots, onions, squash. She had a full woodshed, the result of her and Thomas's summer labor. And she had the land itself. Not the deed, which was a piece of paper, but the physical fact of it. The soil, the stone, the creek, the angle of the sun. She walked the property not as a condemned woman, but as a general studying a battlefield. And her gaze kept returning to the small, slanted doors of the root cellar, set into the earth just behind the cabin. It was deep, dug into a south-facing slope, and walled with stone. Thomas had always praised its ability to keep a consistent temperature, cool in the summer, and just above freezing in the deepest winter. It was a good cellar. But Elspeth saw something more. She saw the seed of an idea her father had planted in her mind 20 years ago, an ocean away. She saw a principle of physics that the town of Two Forks had never heard of, a principle that could hold the killing cold at bay. While the town waited for her to surrender, Elspeth was preparing to dig. The earth held its own form of wealth, and she was about to make a withdrawal. Her father had been a man made of granite and quiet certainty. He was a stonemason from Cornwall, a man who had spent his life underground in the tin mines or above ground, shaping the unyielding rock of the coast into walls that held back the sea. His hands were maps of a hard life, calloused and scarred, but they were possessed of a surprising gentleness. He spoke little, but when he did, he spoke of the physical world as if it were a language he understood intimately. Elspeth, his only child, had been his quiet apprentice, following him not into the mines, but into the logic of his craft. She remembered standing with him on a cold, damp Cornish morning, watching him and his crew complete a cachalofen, a great masonry stove, in the main hall of a manor house. She had been 12. The stove was a towering structure of brick and tile, more an architectural feature than an appliance. "It looks like an altar," she had said. Her father had wiped his hands on a rag, leaving streaks of mortar dust. He smiled, a rare event that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "In a way it is, girl. We're making a sacrifice to the god of winter so he'll leave us be." He tapped the smooth tile face of the stove. "The rich man wants a fire he can see, a big roaring thing in an open hearth. He thinks a big fire means big warmth. He's a fool." He led her to the back of the massive stove, where a small iron door was set near the floor. "All that fire, most of the heat goes right up the chimney with the smoke. A waste. A spectacle." He knelt and opened the small door, pointing into a complex, winding channel of brick. "This is where the work is done. Not in the firebox, but in the flue." He explained it to her not as a lesson, but as a conversation, as one professional sharing a trade secret with another. He drew in the dust on the floor with a stick. A fire, he explained, was a fast, violent release of energy. You could not live inside a fire, but stone. Stone was slow. Stone was patient. The trick was not to sit next to the fire, but to make the fire's heat take a long, slow journey before it could escape. He drew the convoluted path the hot gases would take, doubling back on themselves, winding through a massive weight of brick and stone. "We burn a small hot fire for just an hour or two," he said, his finger tracing the path. "The smoke and heat travel all through this maze. By the time the smoke gets to the chimney, it's cool to the touch. It has given up all its warmth to the stone. The stone holds it. It soaks it up like a sponge. And then," he tapped the massive structure. "For the next 24 hours, the stone just breathes it all back into the room. A slow, gentle, steady warmth. It's not the heat of the fire you feel. It's the memory of the fire held in the stone." He called it thermal mass, the principle of the slow-release battery, but for heat instead of electricity. "Store the heat," he told her, his voice a low rumble. "Don't just make it. Store it, and let it go on its own time. The earth does it every summer, storing the sun's heat deep down to keep the frost from going too deep. A good wall does it. A good stove does it better." Elspeth had stored that knowledge away, a strange and useless fact about the secret life of heat and stone, filed alongside recipes for her mother's saffron cake and the names of Cornish saints. She had never imagined she would need it. She had believed her father because he was her father, his knowledge as solid and unquestionable as the granite he worked. But belief was not the same as understanding. Now, standing before the cold stone walls of her root cellar in the Montana twilight, she felt the principle not as a memory, but as a living instruction. The earth remembered the summer sun, and she, her father's daughter, remembered the stone. She began the work on October 24th, the day the first flock of geese flew south. their calls a lonely, urgent cry in the vast blue sky. Her plan was audacious, born of desperation, and her father's quiet teaching. The existing root cellar was her foundation, a 10 by 12-foot room dug into the hill, its stone walls solid and its ceiling a sturdy framework of thick pine beams. But it was not enough. She would transform it from a storage space into a living space, a hidden, insulated chamber heated by a masonry stove of her own design. This would be her winter home, invisible to the world above. The cabin would be her camouflage, a cold, empty shell to deceive her brother-in-law and the prying eyes of the town. Her true life would be subterranean, warmed by stone. The first task was expansion. She needed a small, separate chamber to house the firebox of the stove, keeping the smoke and fire risk away from her living area. Using a pickaxe and shovel, tools Thomas had left behind, she began digging into the hard-packed earth at the back of the cellar. The work was brutal, punishing. She was strong from farm labor, but this was different. This was mining. Each swing of the pickaxe jarred her shoulders, and her hands, accustomed to the smooth wood of a hoe, were quickly blistered and raw against the rough handle of the shovel. She worked by the light of a single lantern, her world reduced to a small circle of flickering yellow light and the dark, stubborn face of the earth. She timed her labor by the sun, working below ground during the day when she might be seen, and hauling the excavated dirt out in buckets after dark, scattering it carefully along the creek bed, where it would be washed away by the spring melt. Secrecy was her primary defense. Next came the construction of the stove itself. This was the heart of the entire enterprise. She needed two things: mass and a suitable mortar. The mass came from the land. She spent days hauling river stones from the creek, selecting them for size and shape, her wagon groaning under the weight. She chose flat, dense stones for the core of the heating bench and smaller, rounded ones for the fill. The mortar was a greater challenge. Lacking cement, she turned to the earth again. She remembered her father speaking of finding the right clay, a substance that would fire hard and hold the stones together. She tested soil from the creek bank, mixing it with sand and water, forming small patties and baking them in her oven. The third batch was right. It was a sticky, gray clay that dried to a brick-like hardness without cracking. It was an exhausting, filthy process, but when she had a dozen buckets of the prepared mortar, she felt a triumph that was deep and visceral. She built the stove slowly, methodically, following the diagram she had drawn on a piece of scrap wood. First, the firebox, lined with the hardest stones she could find. Then, the beginning of the flue, a complex serpentine channel that would snake its way through the center of a massive stone bench that would double as her bed. The engineering was precise. The flue had to be wide enough to draw properly, but narrow enough to force the hot gases to make contact with the maximum surface area of stone. Every stone was laid with purpose, every gap chinked with her clay mortar. She built a chimney of carefully stacked flat stones, running it up through the new chamber and out through the hillside, camouflaging the opening with a pile of rocks. As the structure grew, it took on the look of a primitive, cyclopean throne. It was ugly, functional, and she prayed, correct. By the time she finished, nearly 3 weeks had passed. Her body ached with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, but the thing was built. A solid, unmovable mass of riverstone and clay, a battery waiting for its first charge. The first true test came on the evening of November 15th. A cold front, born in the Arctic and pushed down the spine of the Rockies, had descended upon the valley. The temperature had been dropping all day, the wind sharpening its teeth on the corners of the cabin. By dusk, the thermometer hanging on the porch read 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and the water in the bucket by the door had a solid inch of ice on it. This was not yet the killing cold Silas had promised, but it was a serious warning. It was time. With a sense of ceremony that felt both foolish and necessary, Elspeth carried a small armload of dry, split pine down the steep cellar steps into her newly finished chamber. The air in the subterranean room was still and cold, smelling of damp earth and curing clay mortar. It was markedly warmer than the cabin above, holding the latent heat of the earth, but it was a passive, tomb-like warmth. She knelt before the small iron door of the firebox, a piece she had salvaged from an old, cracked cookstove. Her hands trembled slightly as she laid the kindling and wood inside, arranging it just as her father had taught her. A small, hot fire was the goal, not a lazy, smoking one. She struck a match. The kindling caught with a whoosh, the flames greedily climbing the larger splits of wood. For a few moments, a puff of smoke backed out into the room, and her heart sank. But then, as the column of air in the flue began to warm, the draft took hold. The smoke vanished up the chimney, and the fire roared to life with a satisfying, deep-throated hum. The system was drawing. That was the first victory. She fed the fire for 2 hours, watching the flames through the small grate, feeling their immediate, radiant heat on her face. The stone around the firebox grew hot to the touch, then too hot to touch. But the great stone bench that snaked through the room remained stubbornly cold. Her father's words echoed in her mind. The stone is patient. She was not. After 2 hours, she let the fire die down to a bed of glowing coals and sealed the firebox door and the chimney damper, trapping every last calorie of heat inside the stone mass. The immediate warmth of the fire was gone, and the room felt colder than before. Doubt, a cold and creeping thing, settled in her stomach. Had she miscalculated? Was it all a folly, a child's misremembered fantasy? She went upstairs to the main cabin, which felt vast and glacial. She ate a cold meal of bread and cheese and climbed into her bed, pulling every blanket she owned over her. She did not expect to sleep. The wind howled outside, a physical presence pressing against the thin walls of the cabin. She lay there listening, feeling the cold seep through the floorboards. After an hour, she could bear the uncertainty no longer. Taking her lantern and the thermometer from the porch, she descended again into the cellar. The air that greeted her at the bottom of the stairs was different. It was not warm, not in the way a fire is warm. It was simply not cold. The sharp, biting edge of the air in the cabin was gone, replaced by a neutral, stable stillness. She placed the thermometer on the far side of the room, away from the stove, and waited. She pressed her palm against the stone bench. It was no longer cold. It was radiating a gentle, almost imperceptible warmth, like a living thing. She waited 10 minutes, her breath held tight in her chest. Then she raised the lantern to the thermometer. The mercury stood at 58 degrees. Outside, it was now 7 degrees, a 51-degree difference. It was working. A slow, deep relief, warmer than any fire, spread through her. She sat on the stone bench, the source of her salvation, and laid her head back against the wall, feeling the steady, stored heat of her own labor seep into her bones. She thought of her father, and for the first time since his death, she wept, not from grief, but from a profound and weary gratitude. Survival was no longer a question of if, but of how hard she was willing to work for it. In the first week of December, as the snows began to settle in for good, the visitors started. The first was Reverend Miller, a well-meaning man whose faith in God was exceeded only by his faith in social convention. He arrived in a small sleigh, his horse blowing clouds of steam in the frigid air. He found the cabin looking disturbingly lifeless. No smoke rose from the chimney, and a fine sifting of snow had collected undisturbed on the porch steps. A deep and abiding quiet hung over the place. His first thought, a dreadful one, was that he was too late. He knocked, and was startled when the door opened a moment later. Elspeth stood there, wrapped in a thick wool coat and scarf. her breath pluming in the air inside the cabin. The room behind her was visibly, shockingly cold. "Mrs. Mercer," the Reverend began, his voice full of a practiced, somber compassion. We were worried. The town." "I am managing, Reverend," Elspeth said. Her voice was steady, but he could see the tension in her face. She did not invite him in. The cold rolling out of the cabin was as definitive a barrier as a locked door. "Your fire is out," he observed, stating the obvious. "It is not safe, my child. There is no shame in accepting help. The ladies of the auxiliary have a room for you, a warm bed." "I have a warm bed, thank you," she replied, and the finality in her tone prevented him from pressing further. He saw her cow, Bess, in the lean-to, looking healthy and well-fed, and a small flock of chickens scratching in a snow-free patch of ground near the foundation. The evidence was contradictory. The woman was clearly alive and her animals cared for, yet her house was as cold as a tomb. He could not reconcile the two things. He left some bread and a small jar of jam on the porch rail, offered a prayer she did not seem to hear, and departed, more confused and worried than when he had arrived. His report to the town was simple. Elspeth Mercer was alive, but she was proud and strange, and she was living in a house without a fire. He feared for her soul, but more immediately, he feared for her life. The second visitors were not so well-meaning. A week after the Reverend's visit, Silas and Clara Mercer returned. They had come not to check on her welfare, but to see the final proof of their victory. They expected to find the cabin abandoned, or to find a desperate woman ready to beg for shelter. They found neither. Like the Reverend, they were struck by the deadness of the place. The chimney was cold, the windows frosted over from the inside. A triumphant smile touched Silas's lips. He had been right. The winter was doing his work for him, but as they drew closer, Clara pointed a gloved finger toward the hill behind the cabin. "Silas," she said, her voice thin. "Smoke." A faint, almost invisible wisp of smoke was rising from what looked like a pile of rocks 50 yards behind the house. It was not the hardy plume of a cabin chimney, but the barest exhalation, visible one moment and gone the next. Silas's brow furrowed. He strode to the cabin door and pounded on it. When Elspeth opened it, he pushed past her into the frigid interior. "What devil's work is this?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the cold, empty room. "Witchcraft? Why is this house not heated?" Elspeth simply stood by the door, her arms crossed, her face a mask of calm endurance. "This is my house, Silas. How I heat it is my concern." "It is not your house," he boomed, his anger amplified by his confusion. He looked around, at the neat but frozen room, then back at her, bundled in her layers of wool. "You cannot survive like this. It's a trick." He stalked back outside, his eyes scanning the property, searching for an explanation that made sense. He saw the tracks leading to the woodshed, the well-tended cow. It did not add up. His worldview, ordered and transactional, had no place for a woman who could live without a fire in the heart of a Montana winter. His frustration curdled into plain cruelty. He turned to her, his face dark. "Fine," he spat. "Stay, freeze. Let the winter have you. When we come back in the spring to take possession, I'll expect to find little more than bones to bury." Clara, for the first time, looked truly frightened. Not of Elspeth, but of her husband. They climbed back into their wagon and left, leaving Elspeth alone in the vast white silence. She did not watch them go. She simply closed the door and went back down to the warmth. The winter that followed was not merely severe. It was a methodical, grinding force that sought to dismantle every structure and life that was not perfectly prepared. The old-timers called it a wolf winter, one that came early and stayed late with teeth of ice. The great blizzard of 1888 arrived on the night of January 12th, a wall of white that erased the world. For 3 days the wind did not cease, and the snow fell without pause, burying fences, roads, and the ambitions of men. In Two Forks, the temperature dropped to 31 degrees below zero and stayed there for a week. The sound of the wind was a constant, high-pitched scream. The cold was not a passive condition. It was an active predator, probing for any weakness, any crack in a wall, any flaw in a plan. Throughout the valley, the story of the winter was written in a series of small, private tragedies. The Jorgensen family, on the north side of the river, lost half their herd of cattle when the roof of their new barn, built too quickly with green lumber, cracked and collapsed under the weight of the snow. They spent 2 days digging out the surviving animals, their hands and faces blackened with frostbite. Reverend Miller, who had preached preparedness, found his own firewood supply, improperly seasoned, burning too fast and producing little heat. His family huddled in a single room around their stove, feeding it furniture to stay alive. A trapper named Dubois, an experienced man of the woods, was found frozen solid 2 miles from town, having lost his way in the whiteout between his trapline and his cabin. His mistake was a small one. He had left without his compass, confident he knew the way. The winter did not forgive such confidence. For most people, survival was a grim, desperate struggle, a matter of enduring from 1 hour to the next, listening to the house creak and groan under the assault. But in the hidden chamber beneath Elspeth Mercer's cold, silent cabin, the story was different. Down in the earth, the blizzard was a distant rumor, a muffled roar far overhead. The system performed exactly as she had designed it, as her father had promised it would. Every morning, she burned a single, small, hot fire in her masonry stove for 90 minutes. The mass of stone and clay absorbed the heat, and for the next 24 hours, the stone bench radiated a steady, silent warmth. The temperature in her subterranean room never dropped below 60 degrees. She had light from 2 lanterns and a store of lamp oil. She had water, which she got by melting buckets of clean snow she gathered from just outside her hidden door. She had her stores of potatoes, onions, and squash from the garden, and sacks of flour and cornmeal. Bess, her cow, was housed in the reinforced lean-to against the cabin, which shared a wall with the cellar. A small amount of heat radiated through the stone, keeping the cow from freezing, and in return, the animal's body heat contributed to the overall thermal stability of the structure. She had created a closed, self-sustaining ecosystem. While the world above suffered, Elspeth sat on her warm stone bench, mending a shirt by the light of a lantern, listening to the quiet hum of her own survival. The contrast was the entire argument. The dismissed, dispossessed woman, armed only with knowledge, was living in quiet comfort, while the established community, with all its resources, fought a losing battle against the cold. The winter reached its nadir on the 3rd night of the blizzard, the thermometer on the porch of the empty cabin above her cracking as the mercury froze in the bulb. Down below, Elspeth slept soundly, warmed by the memory of a fire. On the 5th day of the blizzard, when the wind had finally subsided to a low moan and the snow had temporarily ceased, a new sound broke the profound silence. It was a desperate, frantic knocking, not at the cabin's main door, but at the heavy storm door that covered the slanted entrance to the root cellar. Elspeth froze, listening. No one should have been out. No one could have known she was down here. The knocking came again, weaker this time, accompanied by a man's raw-throated shout. "Hello? Is anyone in there? Please, for the love of God, help us!" She unbarred the door from the inside and pushed it open against a heavy drift of snow. The figure that stumbled in, half falling down the steps, was Eric Larson, a neighbor from a homestead 2 miles downriver. His face was a mask of frozen snow and ice, his beard a solid mass. Behind him, his wife, Inga, huddled with their 2 small children, the youngest of whom was wrapped in a blanket and making a terrible, shallow, rasping sound. Our chimney, Eric gasped, his body racked with shivers. The flue, it clogged with ice and snow, filled the cabin with smoke. We couldn't breathe. We had to get out. He looked around the warm, dry, well-lit chamber, his eyes wide with disbelief. It was like stumbling from the frozen hell of the surface into a secret pocket of summer. What? What is this place? Elspeth wasted no time on explanations. Bring them in. Get them by the heat. She took the youngest child, a girl of 4 named Anna, from Inga's arms. The child's skin was waxy and pale, her breathing dangerously shallow. Elspeth immediately began stripping away the child's damp clothes, wrapping her in dry wool blankets, and placing her on the warmest part of the stone bench. She recognized the first signs of serious frostbite and hypothermia. She prepared a warm, sweet broth, forcing a few sips between the girl's blue lips. She treated the whole family with a calm, efficient authority, issuing quiet commands for them to remove their wet things and drink the hot liquid she provided. For 2 days, the Larsens recuperated in her sanctuary. The warmth, food, and rest worked their slow magic. Anna's breathing eased, and the color returned to her cheeks. But Elspeth knew that charity was not enough. To give them shelter was to save them for a day. To give them knowledge was to save them for a lifetime. On the 3rd day, when Eric's strength had returned, she took him to her stove. She explained the entire principle not as magic, but as physics. She drew diagrams in the dirt floor with a stick, showing him the winding flue, the concept of thermal mass, the importance of a small, hot fire. Your stove, she explained, is built to make heat. This stove is built to keep heat. She showed him the flaws in his own cabin's design. The straight, inefficient flue that sent all the warmth up the chimney. The uninsulated stone hearth that leached heat into the frozen ground. She taught him. She refused to be a mere savior, a dispenser of aid. She was a teacher, and the lesson was survival. When the storm finally broke and the Larsens were able to return to their home, they left not just with their lives, but with a new understanding. Eric Larsen went home and, following Elspeth's instructions, rebuilt his own stove and chimney. The knowledge was now his. Word of the miracle cellar began to spread, carried on the testimony of a grateful and humbled man. More people came, not for handouts, but for lessons. Elspeth Mercer, the strange, proud widow, had become the quiet, unassuming center of the valley's survival. 10 days after the great blizzard broke, when the valley was just beginning to dig itself out, another set of visitors made their way through the massive snowdrifts to Elspeth's homestead. The horse was exhausted, and the fine sleigh it pulled was battered, one of its runners crudely splinted with a piece of wood. The figures huddled in the sleigh were Silas and Clara Mercer. They looked not like landowners coming to claim their property, but like refugees. Their fine wool coats were torn and soiled, their faces hollowed out by fear and exhaustion. They did not knock. They simply stood in the snow before the cold, silent cabin, their shoulders slumped in defeat. Elspeth, who had been clearing a path to the chicken coop, saw them from a distance. She set down her shovel and walked toward them, her steps steady and even in the deep snow. She said nothing, merely waiting. It was Clara who spoke first, her voice a broken whisper. The roof. The main beam. She gestured vaguely back in the direction of their own impressive 2-story house. The weight of the snow. It just cracked, like a gunshot. The whole north side of the roof came down. Silas stared at the ground, his face a ruin of pride and shame. He, the man of business and practicality, had built his house with a contractor from Helena who had prized speed over quality. The timbers were undersized, the joinery poor. It was a house built for appearance, not for a Montana winter. It had failed the first serious test it had ever faced. They had spent 2 days in the root cellar of their own collapsed home before, humbled and freezing. They had yoked their horse and come to the one place they knew, impossibly, was warm. "We have nowhere else to go," Clara finished, tears freezing on her cheeks. Elspeth looked at them. She looked at Silas, the man who had legally dispossessed her, the man who had told her to freeze and let the winter have her. She saw no triumph in his defeat, only a common human misery. The cold made no distinction between the righteous and the cruel. It was an impartial judge. She looked at his face, expecting to feel a surge of vindication, of righteous anger. Instead, she felt only a vast, quiet stillness. The argument was over. The verdict had been rendered, not by her, but by the snow and the stone. She simply stood aside and gestured with her head toward the slanted doors of the root cellar. "Downstairs," she said. It was not an invitation. It was a statement of fact. "This is where the warmth is." She led them down into her sanctuary, into the warm, lamplit air that smelled of baking bread and dry earth. The Larson children were playing quietly on a blanket in the corner. Inga Larson looked up as the Mercers entered, her face hardening for a moment, before she saw the look on Elspeth's face and softened her expression. Elspeth treated Silas and Clara exactly as she had treated the Larsons. She gave them blankets. She gave them hot broth and bread. She pointed to a space on the floor where they could sleep. She offered no words of comfort, but also no words of reproach. The absolute impartial equality of her treatment was the most profound judgment of all. She did not need to be their judge because she had made a world where she was no longer their subject. Silas sat on a wooden crate, holding the warm mug of broth in trembling hands, and stared at the great stone bench, the source of this impossible warmth. He was finally beginning to understand the nature of the asset he had tried, and failed, to seize. He had tried to claim the paper, and she had mastered the stone. In the spring, when the thaw came and the roads to Helena were finally clear, a letter arrived for Elspeth by post. It was a legal notice from the county clerk. Silas Mercer had formally withdrawn his lien and relinquished all claim to the property. The deed, free and clear, was now solely in her name. He had not done it out of charity or a change of heart, but because the entire valley, led by the quiet testimony of the Larson family, had borne witness. His social standing in Two Forks was ruined, and he could not bear to live among people who had seen his failure and her triumph so plainly. Time in the valley began to flow again with the spring melt. The seasons turned, and the story of the winter of '88 passed into local legend. Elspeth Mercer, the woman who had refused to freeze, became a fixture of that legend, a quiet and formidable presence. The years that followed were not a return to how things were, but the beginning of something new. That first summer, Eric Larson and 3 other men from the valley came to her, not for help, but with it. They helped her shore up the cabin, re-chink the walls, and build a proper stone foundation under the lean-to, replacing the temporary structure with one made to last. In return, she taught them everything. With their help, she refined her design for the masonry stove, creating a smaller, more efficient version that could be built into existing cabins. They called it the __51_51__, and by the turn of the century, nearly every home in the Two Forks Valley had one. The knowledge spread, carried by word of mouth and handwritten diagrams, a quiet revolution of warmth and self-sufficiency. A reporter from a Helena newspaper came out one year, having heard the story. He wanted to write a sensational piece about the __52_. He found not a wild woman, but a calm, dignified woman tending her garden. She answered his questions with simple, factual statements and showed him the cellar and the stove. He asked if she planned to patent the design. __53__, he'd said. Elspeth had looked at him, her eyes clear and direct. "The knowledge was given to me," she said, It belongs to anyone who needs it. The reporter, humbled, wrote a different kind of story, one about resilience and community. The Larsons became the family she never had. Their children grew up calling her Aunt Elspeth, spending summers helping in her garden and winters learning to read by the light of her lantern. Silas and Clara sold their ruined property for a pittance and moved back east, vanishing from the valley's memory. Reverend Miller preached a famous sermon on the parable of the foolish man who built his house on sand and the wise woman who dug her foundations deep into the rock. Elspeth lived on the land for another 40 years. She never remarried, finding sufficiency in her own competence and the deep friendships she had forged in the crucible of that first winter. She grew old, her movements slowing, but her mind remained as sharp as the winter air. On cold nights, she would sit on the stone bench, which she now used only in the very deepest cold, and feel its steady, radiant warmth. She would sometimes speak quietly into the stillness, a conversation with a Cornish stonemason a world and a lifetime away, telling him that he had been right about the stone. She died in her sleep one night in March of 1929, at the age of 79, in her own bed in the cabin above, which was now fortified and warm. Decades passed. The homestead was sold again, and eventually fell into disuse, the cabin slowly surrendering to the seasons. In 1957, a new family bought the land, intending to clear the old structures and build a modern house. They brought in a bulldozer to knock down the derelict cabin. As the machine pushed the collapsed timbers aside, it struck something solid. The driver stopped, and the owner came to look. They cleared away the dirt and debris and uncovered the heavy, slanted storm doors. Prying them open, they revealed a set of stone steps leading down into darkness. With flashlights, they descended into a perfectly preserved, dry stone chamber. The air was cool and still, and against the far wall, a massive, sinuous bench of river stone stood silent and solid, an altar to a god of winter that had been placated long ago. The structure had outlived its maker, a final, wordless testament to the woman who had understood the earth's memory and had refused to be moved.